The storm had started earlier than expected that evening. Thick, wet flakes fell in heavy curtains, swallowing the headlights of my car as I grouped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Most people would have stayed inside on a night like this, but something had gnawed at me all day, an instinct I couldn't ignore. It had been weeks since I'd heard more than a polite, clipped text from my daughter, Claire. She lived less than an hour away, but lately it felt like she was on another planet. Ever since she'd married into the Whitmore family, wealthy, respected, untouchable, I had felt her slipping through my fingers. Phone calls screened, visits politely declined, her once lively voice reduced to whispers of, "I'm busy, Mom, everything's fine." But that night, as the snow thickened and the roads emptied, I couldn't shake the bone-deep feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was just imagining it, that Claire was warm and safe in that sprawling mansion, sipping cocoa by the fire with her husband's family. But my foot pressed harder on the gas, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. By the time I pulled into the long, circular driveway of the Whitmore estate, the storm was in full force. Snowdrifts piled against the gates, and the wind howled through the bare trees like an angry warning. The mansion itself glowed in the distance, golden light spilling from every window. Inside, I could see silhouettes, men raising glasses, women in shimmering gowns, laughter spilling into the night like music, a Christmas gathering in full swing. But then, through the blur of snow, I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A small figure hunched near the stone walkway, barely visible in the storm. But as my headlights swept across the drive, the shape sharpened into someone unmistakable. My daughter. Claire sat on the ground, her knees pulled tight against her chest, arms wrapped around herself in a desperate attempt to hold in what little warmth she had left. Her hair was damp with snow, her face chalky white, her lips tinged blue. For a moment, I froze. The sight was too surreal, too grotesque. How could she, my daughter, their daughter-in-law, be outside in this weather, while inside, just steps away, her husband's family toasted by the fire? I shoved the car door open, the icy wind slicing into me like knives. "Claire!" My voice cracked as I stumbled through the snow toward her. She lifted her head, startled, and when her eyes met mine, I felt my chest splinter. Not because of the frost clinging to her lashes or the tremor in her body, but because of the shame in her gaze. "Mom, you shouldn't be here." Her words were a whisper, ragged from the cold. I dropped to my knees in the snow, ignoring the chill seeping into my skin. I pulled her into my arms, horrified at how light she felt, how violently she shivered. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, my voice half broken with fear. They said I needed to think about what I'd done," she murmured, eyes darting toward the mansion. Inside, laughter swelled, the sound grotesquely cheerful against the misery outside. Through the frosted window, I could see her husband, Stephen, swirling a glass of wine, his arm draped casually over a relative's chair as though nothing at all were amiss. "What you done?" My stomach knotted. "Claire, this is insane. You could have died out here." She tried to shrink into herself, her voice barely audible. "I spoke up. I disagreed at dinner. That was disrespectful. This is how they correct me." Her words hit me harder than the snowstorm ever could. Correction? As if she were a child. As if humiliation, freezing, suffering in the dark were reasonable punishments for daring to speak her mind. I pulled my coat tighter around her, shielding her from the wind. My heart thundered with rage and terror. For a moment, I wanted to storm into that glittering room, drag every single one of them into the snow, and force them to feel the cold clawing at my daughter's skin. But Claire clutched at my sleeve, panic flaring in her eyes. "Don't, Mom, please, you'll only make it worse." I stared at her, at the girl who had once filled our home with laughter and fire and endless questions. Now she sat trembling in silence, terrified of her own voice. And the worst part? She believed this was normal. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Come on, we're leaving." "No," her head jerked up, fear spiking through her eyes. "If they find out I left without permission?" "Permission?" My voice cracked, almost breaking under the weight of the word. "Claire, you're not their prisoner. You're my daughter." Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, torn between loyalty to the family that had broken her spirit and the faint spark of freedom I was trying to hand her back. I tightened my grip, lowering my voice to something steady, something she could cling to. "Listen to me. Whatever they've made you believe, you don't deserve this. You never did. And I will not leave you here to freeze while they raise their glasses inside." For a long, trembling moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she let her head rest against my shoulder. A faint sob escaped her, muffled by the storm. That was all the permission I needed. I half lifted, half guided her to the car, bundling her inside and blasting the heat. Her body shook violently, teeth chattering, but the color began to creep back into her cheeks. As I pulled away from the mansion, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Through the glowing windows, I caught sight of Stephen lifting his glass in another toast, utterly unaware or uncaring that his wife was gone. Something dark and hot surged through me. They thought they could discard her like this. They thought they could erase her spirit, lock her outside like an animal, and no one would know. But they hadn't counted on me. That night, as snow battered the windshield and my daughter trembled beside me, I swore a silent vow. I would uncover the truth of what they had done to her. I would tear apart the walls of that mansion brick by brick if I had to, because this wasn't just cruelty, it was control, and I intended to end it.
The drive back to my house was silent, except for the hiss of snow against the windshield. My daughter sat curled in the passenger seat, wrapped in every blanket I could find, staring blankly out the window. She hadn't said a word since we left the Whitmore mansion. But silence speaks. Silence screams. Her hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of something she'd been carrying for far too long. I wanted to demand answers, to pull over right there, grab her shoulders, and beg her to tell me everything. But I knew if I pushed too hard, she would retreat into that invisible prison they'd built around her. So I drove. Quietly. Patiently. When we finally reached home, I guided her inside, sat her by the fire, and made her a hot cup of tea. She clutched it like it was life itself, staring into the steam, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but the words caught, strangled in her throat. Minutes ticked by. Finally, she whispered, "Mom, you don't understand. This wasn't the first time." Her voice was hoarse, like admitting that tiny truth cost her everything. My chest tightened, but I kept my tone steady. "Then help me understand, Claire." She lifted her gaze, her eyes hollow yet pleading. "They make it seem like love. That's how it starts. Every rule, every punishment, it's always for my own good. At least, that's what they say." I stayed very still. "What kind of rules, Claire?" She swallowed hard, twisting the blanket tighter around herself. "Rules about how I speak? Rules about what I wear? Rules about how much food is on my plate, how much water I drink, how often I smile in public? Rules about when I'm allowed to talk, when I have to stay silent?" I felt my heart hammering in my chest, fury building, but I didn't let it spill out. She needed calm. They call it maintaining dignity." She continued, her voice faltering.
Stephen's mother says women in their family must embody grace. His father says obedience makes a marriage strong. And Stephen? Her voice cracked. He says it's the only way I'll be accepted. I wanted to scream, to storm into that mansion and drag them all into the snow where I had found her. But Claire's trembling hands reminded me this wasn't about my rage. It was about her survival. So I asked softly, "And when you don't follow their rules?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. "They isolate me. Sometimes they send me outside. Sometimes they take away food, or they make me sit in silence while everyone else eats. Once I was locked in a guest room for 2 days. They said it was to help me reflect." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And tonight I spoke against his father. I told him I didn't agree with the way they were treating one of the staff. They laughed at me. Then Stephen's mother said I had embarrassed the family in front of guests. They told me to sit outside until I learned humility." Her hand shook so violently the tea nearly spilled. I reached out, steadying her cup. My jaw ached from the force it took not to shout. "Claire, this is abuse." She flinched at the word, shaking her head quickly. No, you don't understand. They say it's tradition. They say it's love. And Stephen tells me I'll ruin everything if I fight it. He says if I just listen, if I just obey, life will be perfect. And sometimes it is perfect. He buys me gifts, he apologizes, he tells me no one else could ever love me the way he does. Her eyes darted to mine, searching, desperate. "Mom, what if he's right? What if I really am the problem?" The crack in her voice shattered something in me. I leaned forward, cupping her face gently. "No, Claire, you are not the problem. They are. Love is not freezing outside in the snow while your husband laughs by the fire. Love is not silence or starvation or shame. Love does not look like this." Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and endless. She clung to my hands like they were the only solid thing left in her world. For hours that night, she poured it all out. The constant correction, the endless guilt, the gaslighting, convincing her that she was ungrateful, dramatic, unworthy of the Whitmore name. She confessed that she hadn't called me in weeks because Stephen read her messages, monitored her calls, and shamed her whenever she reached out for help. Every piece of her freedom had been chipped away until she barely recognized herself. By the time she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep on the couch, my heart felt like it had been carved open. I tucked the blanket tighter around her, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest. And I made a vow in that moment. They had broken my daughter down piece by piece. They had convinced her that suffering was love, but they had made one fatal mistake. They left her mother outside of their control. And I would burn their golden mansion to the ground if that's what it took to free her. The next day. Morning came gray and heavy with snow. Claire stirred awake slowly, her eyes flickering open, confusion settling as she realized she wasn't in the Whitmore mansion. For the briefest second, relief washed over her face, but then the fear returned, sharp and suffocating. "They'll come for me," she whispered. "Let them," I said firmly. Her lips parted, startled by my resolve. "Mom, you don't understand. They'll ruin you. They'll ruin us both." I sat down beside her, steady. "No, Claire. They only have power if we let them, and I won't let them take one more ounce of your life." Her hands tightened around the blanket, her voice breaking. "But Stephen, I love him." The raw ache in her voice made my chest tighten. I had been bracing for anger, for resentment, but not this. Not the loyalty she still clung to even after everything. "I know you do," I said softly. "But love doesn't chain you. Love doesn't silence you. Love does not make you smaller. Whatever he's given you,
It isn't love, Claire. It's control. Her face crumbled, her tears spilling again, because deep down, she already knew I was right. I pulled her into my arms, stroking her hair like I had when she was a child, and in that moment, I realized the truth. This fight wouldn't just be against Stephen or his family. It would be against the hold they had over her mind. But I was ready.
The storm had barely lifted when the first knock rattled my front door. It was sharp, precise, and far too early for visitors. Claire froze mid-step in the kitchen, her mug clattering softly against the counter. I saw the panic flicker across her face before she even spoke. "It's them." I put a hand on her arm. "Stay here." The knock came again, harder this time. I opened the door to find two men in long black coats standing on my porch. They weren't neighbors. They weren't delivery men. They were Whitmores. One introduced himself with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Bennet, Douglas Whitmore would like to discuss last night's misunderstanding." My jaw tightened. Misunderstanding. That was the word they used for leaving my daughter half frozen in the snow? "I don't think there's anything to discuss," I replied evenly. "My daughter won't be returning to your home." His smile sharpened, his gaze sliding past me toward the warm glow of the fireplace where Claire stood, trembling. "Mrs. Bennet, you're mistaken. Claire is a Whitmore now, and what happens between husband and wife is not for outsiders to interfere with." His words dripped with condescension, but I recognized the threat coiled beneath them. Outsiders. That's what I was. That's what they wanted me to remain. I straightened. "She's my daughter, and she's not going anywhere with you." His smile faded then. The second man stepped forward, his voice colder, harder. "You don't want to make this difficult. Families like yours don't fare well against families like ours." Before I could respond, Claire appeared behind me, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not going back." For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy between us. Then both men exchanged a glance, a silent calculation, and stepped back. "Very well," the first man said lightly, though his eyes were like steel. "But Mrs. Bennet, I'd advise caution. The Whitmore family is very protective of its reputation. It would be unfortunate if this became messy." Without waiting for a reply, they turned and strode back through the snow, their polished shoes leaving stark imprints that felt like warnings carved into the earth. I closed the door, locking it twice. My hands shook, only slightly. Claire leaned against the wall, pale and trembling. "They won't stop," she whispered. "You don't know them. They always get what they want." I gripped her shoulders, steadying her. "Claire, look at me." Her tear-filled eyes met mine. "You are not property. You are not theirs to own or silence or destroy. They may have power, but we have something they'll never understand: truth. And truth is harder to kill than any lie they spread." Her breath shuddered, her hands clutching mine desperately, as though she wanted to believe but couldn't. And I realized this battle would not just be against the Whitmores, it would be against the chains they had locked around her mind. The plan. The next morning, I made calls of my own, to an old friend who worked as a journalist, to another who knew her way around family court, and to a detective who had once owed me a favor. Piece by piece, I began to build a shield around Claire. If the Whitmores wanted war, they would get it, but it would be on my terms. The first attack. It didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. By noon that same day, whispers had already started circulating in town. Old friends called me, confused. Neighbors glanced at me differently when I stepped outside. And when I logged into my email, I found them. Anonymous messages dripping with venom. She's unstable. She's manipulating her daughter. She's trying to extort money from the Whitmores. Lie after lie, carefully planted, all designed to erode my credibility before I even had a chance to speak. Claire sat beside me as I scrolled, her face blanching at each poisonous line.
"This is what they do," she whispered. "When Stephen's cousin tried to leave, they destroyed her. She couldn't find work, her friends turned against her, even her own family believed the Whitmores. She had no choice but to go back." Her voice trembled. "Mom, I can't survive that. I can't." I turned to her, fierce. "Yes, you can. Because you're not alone this time." She blinked at me, tears gathering in her eyes. "You don't understand. They'll dig through everything, every mistake I've ever made, every weakness. They'll use it all against me." "Then let them try," I said. "We'll be ready." But even as I spoke, I knew the danger was real. The phone call. That evening, the phone rang. Not my cell, my old landline, the one hardly anyone used anymore. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Bennett?" The voice was smooth, commanding, and unmistakable. Douglas Whitmore himself. "I'm calling as a courtesy," he said, as though he were granting me a favor. "Claire is my daughter-in-law. She belongs with her husband. Whatever misunderstanding led her to your doorstep must be corrected. You understand how appearances matter in our world." I kept my voice firm. "What I understand is that my daughter nearly froze to death outside your home while your family celebrated inside. She's not going back." His tone cooled instantly, the charm dropping like a mask. "You're making a mistake. Do you really believe a woman like Claire can stand against a family like mine? We can bury her. We can bury you." The venomous words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to falter. "You can try," I said evenly, "but I will not let you break her any further." There was silence on the line, heavy, deliberate. Then softly, "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." The call clicked dead. I stood frozen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the echo of his threat ringing louder than the storm outside. Claire's fear. That night, Claire paced the living room, her anxiety unraveling her piece by piece. "You don't understand, Mom. Douglas doesn't lose. No one defies him. If he says he'll bury us, he will. He controls the courts, the newspapers, the police, even Stephen. He worships his father. He'll never let me go." Her fear was raw, suffocating. I caught her shoulders, steadying her. "Claire, look at me." Her tear-filled eyes met mine. "You are not property. You are not theirs to own or silence or destroy. They may have power, but we have something they'll never understand: truth. And truth is harder to kill than any lie they spread." Her breath shuddered, her hands clutching mine desperately, as though she wanted to believe but couldn't. And I realized this battle would not just be against the Whitmores, it would be against the chains they had locked around her mind. The plan. The next morning, I made calls of my own, to an old friend who worked as a journalist, to another who knew her way around family court, and to a detective who had once owed me a favor. Piece by piece, I began to build a shield around Claire. If the Whitmores wanted war, they would get it, but it would be on my terms.
The Whitmores thought intimidation would silence us, but they underestimated something far greater than their money and power: a mother's resolve. A fragile morning. The next morning dawned gray, the sky heavy with snow that never seemed to end. I brewed coffee in silence, listening to the creak of floorboards as Claire wandered into the kitchen, her hair tousled, her eyes swollen from a night of broken sleep. She sat across from me, wrapping trembling fingers around the warm mug I pushed toward her. "They're not going to stop, Mom," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I know them. They'll keep tightening their grip until I'm crawling back." I leaned forward, steady. "Then we tighten ours first. They've made this a war, and in a war, the side that controls the truth wins."
She looked at me, her expression flickering between fear and a fragile hope. Calling in favors. By mid-morning, my dining table had transformed into something that resembled a war room. Piles of documents, notes scrawled in my hurried handwriting, and a laptop screen glowing with emails from the people I had contacted the day before. First came Jonathan, an old journalist friend who had once exposed a corruption scandal in the city council. He still had contacts in the press and promised he'd sniff around the Whitmore's empire. Then came Diane, a lawyer I trusted from years ago when she had defended a friend in a brutal custody battle. She replied with one line that sent a surge of determination through me. "I'll take this case, but we play to win." And then Lieutenant Rivera, the detective I had called on as a last resort. Her text arrived mid-afternoon. "Meet me tonight. I've heard whispers about the Whitmores. You may have more allies than you think." Piece by piece, the net began to weave itself together. Claire speaks. That evening, as snow whipped against the windows, Claire finally began to talk. Really talk. She sat curled on the couch, her voice shaking as years of buried truth began to spill out. It started small. Little comments from Stephen, criticisms about my clothes, my voice, the way I laughed. Then his mother would step in, telling me it was my duty to listen, to please him, to remember my place. At first, I thought it was just family dynamics. But then they isolated me. No phone calls without permission, no visits to friends, even my work emails were monitored. And whenever I resisted, Stephen would remind me that his father owned the very roof over my head, that I was nothing without them. His eyes brimmed with tears. I believed them. I believed I was nothing, that I should be grateful just to exist in their shadow. I reached for her hand, my voice steady but burning. "You are not nothing, Claire, and I will make sure the world knows exactly what they tried to do to you." Her hand tightened around mine like a lifeline. The first strike. The counterattack began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a simple article. Jonathan published a piece in an online journal that evening, a subtle, careful beginning. It didn't name the Whitmores outright, but it described the pattern of coercive control within certain prominent families. It hinted at financial improprieties buried under generations of wealth. The story spread like wildfire across social media, not because it was explicit, but because it was suggestive. Everyone in Boston's upper circles began whispering, could it be the Whitmores? And in their world, reputation was currency. The first cracks in their empire had begun to show. Douglas responds. It didn't take long for the king to strike back. 2 days later, Douglas Whitmore himself appeared in a televised interview, smooth and composed, denouncing cowardly rumors meant to tarnish his family's legacy. He smiled, that polished smile, the one that had charmed politicians and businessmen for decades, and painted himself as the victim of a vindictive smear campaign. And then, with calculated precision, he turned his attention to Claire. "My daughter-in-law," he said warmly, "is a troubled young woman. We've done everything to support her. Unfortunately, she has been misled by outside influences. But as a family, we will do what we've always done, stand together and protect our own." The implication was clear. Claire was unstable, I was manipulative, and the Whitmores, they were the saints. Claire saw the broadcast and crumbled. She sank to the floor, clutching her head, whispering over and over, "I can't fight this. I can't fight him." I knelt beside her, lifting her chin until her tear-filled eyes met mine. Yes, you can, because he just made a mistake. Shifting the narrative.
I called Jonathan and Diane immediately. I said, "He went public. He put Claire on record as unstable. That means he's no longer hiding behind shadows. He's committed himself to a narrative, which means we can dismantle it." Diane's voice was sharp, decisive. Then we hit him where it hurts. Documentation. If Claire has journals, emails, anything that proves coercion or abuse, we file. Once it's in the court record, Douglas can't sweep it under the rug. Claire hesitated when I asked her about proof. She vanished into her room and returned with a worn leather journal, its pages filled with years of entries, her secret rebellion. Stephen had never found it. The entries were heartbreaking. Dates, conversations, moments of cruelty masked as discipline, times she was denied contact with friends, times she was left shivering outside as punishment. Each word was a dagger, but together they formed a weapon. We copied everything. Diane prepared filings, Jonathan prepared follow-ups, and Lieutenant Rivera promised to start discreet inquiries. The Whitmores had money, but now we had evidence. Claire's turning point. That night, as we prepared the documents, Claire looked different. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. "Do you think anyone will believe me?" she asked quietly. I smiled, fierce and unwavering. "They don't have to believe you, Claire. They just have to read your truth. And once it's out there, it can't be taken back." Her hand tightened around mine. The threat escalated. The next day, retaliation escalated. My car tires were slashed, anonymous calls filled my voicemail with threats, and Claire received a chilling message slipped under our door. "Run now while you still can." Claire's hands shook as she held the note, but I burned it in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the threat. "They're scared," I told her. "This is desperation, and desperation means we're winning." The coalition. By the end of that week, our coalition had solidified. Jonathan's articles were gaining traction. Diane filed petitions with the court, forcing the Whitmores into uncomfortable positions. And Rivera's quiet investigation began uncovering whispers of financial fraud and political manipulation tied directly to Douglas. For the first time, the Whitmores weren't the only ones writing the narrative. We were too. And as I looked around my living room, filled with laptops, legal pads, and determined allies, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about saving Claire anymore. It was about exposing an entire system of control that had broken countless women before her. And if we succeeded, it wouldn't just be the Whitmores who fell. It would be the empire they had built on silence.
The Whitmores always thrived in shadows, deals behind closed doors, smiles hiding daggers. They built their empire on silence. So when the silence broke, when the first real headline hit, their fortress trembled. The article that shook Boston. On a snowy Monday morning, Jonathan's article went live. This time, there were no veiled hints or gentle suggestions. Names were named, documents were attached. Screenshots of Claire's journal entries, medical records of her untreated hypothermia, testimony from former Whitmore employees who described the culture of obedience inside the family estate. The headline was brutal. Behind the fireplace, the Whitmore's empire of control and silence. Within hours, it was everywhere. Talk shows debated it, social media swarmed with outrage, former acquaintances came forward adding fuel to the fire. What had once been whispers in private circles now burned across every news outlet. For the first time in decades, the Whitmores weren't untouchable. The aftermath at home. Claire sat on the couch, staring at the television as anchors dissected her life. Her trembling hands clutched a blanket, her lips parted in disbelief.
They know my name. Everyone knows my name. I knelt beside her, my voice firm. Yes, and now they'll know your truth. You don't have to hide anymore. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't only tears of fear. There was something else, something like relief. For years, she had lived as if she were invisible. Now, finally, the world saw her. Douglas strikes back. But Douglas Whitmore wasn't a man who bowed to storms. He was the kind who built dams and broke those who tried to breach them. That very evening, he called his own press conference. Standing in front of the Whitmore estate gates, flanked by Stephen and Eleanor, he delivered a performance polished to perfection. My family has become the victim of a malicious slander campaign, he declared, his voice booming with righteous indignation. We have welcomed Claire as one of our own, and this betrayal is nothing short of heartbreaking. We will pursue every legal action to protect our family's honor. He paused, lowering his tone, his eyes shining with feigned sorrow. It grieves me most that a mother, someone who should stand for love, has instead poisoned her daughter with lies. We pray Claire finds healing. Until then, we will remain steadfast in protecting our family. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Douglas turned grief into performance, accusation into theater. And once again, he painted Claire as broken, me as manipulative. Cracks in the armor. But even the best performances can't hide the truth forever. As Douglas spoke, Eleanor Whitmore's hands trembled at her sides. Cameras caught the flicker in her expression, the tightness around her mouth, the way her gaze darted away from Claire's name when Douglas spoke it. Later that night, Jonathan called. Your article did more than stir the pot. It rattled the queen. He was right. Eleanor was showing cracks, and in a family where appearances were everything, cracks were fatal. Claire's decision. That night, as snow battered the windows, Claire stood before me, her face pale but determined. I want to speak, she said. I blinked. To the press? To everyone, she replied, her voice steadier than I had ever heard it. I've hidden long enough. If Douglas can stand there and perform, so can I. Except I won't be performing. I'll be telling the truth. Her courage startled me, but I saw the fire in her eyes. This wasn't the fragile girl I had found shivering by the fireplace. This was a woman reclaiming her voice. And I knew we had reached the point of no return. The public testimony. The next morning, Claire sat before a circle of cameras in a modest community center, far from the Whitmore's gilded gates. Diane sat at her side, Jonathan in the back, Rivera keeping watch near the door. Her hands shook at first, but as she began to speak, her voice grew stronger. I was raised to believe marriage was sacred, that love meant sacrifice, but what I endured in the Whitmore home wasn't love. It was control. I was silenced, isolated, and punished. The night I was found in the snow wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of being treated as less than human. Her words were raw, honest, painful, and undeniable. For 20 minutes, she spoke, tears slipping down her cheeks, her voice breaking and rebuilding. By the end, the room was silent, except for the clicking of cameras capturing history. And then, softly but powerfully, she ended with one line that became the quote plastered across newspapers the next day. I will not freeze in silence anymore. The war escalated. The Whitmores erupted. Lawsuits were filed within hours. Defamation, emotional distress, attempted extortion. Stephen sneered from behind Douglas in interviews, parroting his father's lines about family loyalty. Their lawyers swarmed like hornets, filing injunctions to silence Claire's testimony. But with every desperate move they made, the public tide shifted further against them. Protests sparked outside their estate gates. Hashtags trended. Sponsors pulled out of Whitmore businesses. The mighty empire, once built on silence, was now drowning in noise. And then, unexpectedly, came Eleanor. It was a week after Claire's testimony. Snow still lay thick on the ground when a black car pulled into my driveway. Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a fur coat, her face pale and drawn. Claire froze when she saw her. I moved instinctively, standing between them. But Eleanor raised her hands, her voice trembling. I didn't come to fight. I came to talk. She entered my home for the first time, her eyes darting around the modest walls as though she had stepped into another world. And then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I can't keep lying for him anymore." The room went silent. The matriarch broke. Over the next hour, Eleanor poured out truths that shocked even me. She had known for years what Douglas was. She had endured her own silent punishments, her own humiliations, but she had chosen survival. She admitted that she had enabled Stephen, encouraged his cruelty to Claire, because she feared Douglas's wrath more than she feared her own conscience. But now, with the world watching, she could no longer endure the lies. Her voice cracked as she looked at Claire. "I let it happen to you. And for that, I don't deserve forgiveness, but I will give you the one thing I can: evidence." She slid an envelope across the table. Inside were financial records, photographs, and personal letters, proof of corruption and control that only the matriarch could have possessed. For the first time, the queen had turned against the king. A shift in the war. That night, our war room grew stronger. Diane nearly cried when she saw the documents. Jonathan said it was enough to topple a dynasty. And Rivera promised that with Eleanor's cooperation, criminal charges might actually stick. For the first time, I saw something in Claire I had never seen before. Not just relief, not just courage, but victory.
The Whitmores had always believed they were untouchable. For decades, their empire had stood like an impenetrable fortress. But fortresses don't collapse all at once. They crack, they splinter, and then, all at once, they fall. And that fall had begun. The court of public opinion. The courtroom came first. By early spring, the Whitmores were dragged before a judge, not for defamation as they had hoped, but for fraud, coercion, and obstruction. Eleanor's evidence had been the key. Her files revealed decades of manipulation: offshore accounts, gag orders paid in cash, medical bills lost and falsified, even the names of therapists who had been bribed to label victims as unstable. When Rivera presented it all, even the judge looked shaken. But it wasn't only the law that mattered now. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, holding signs with Claire's quote in bold letters: "I will not freeze in silence anymore." Her words had become a movement. Douglas's unraveling. At first, Douglas maintained his usual performance. Calm, polished. He entered the courtroom with tailored suits, his chin high, his voice commanding. He sneered at every witness, smirked at every accusation. But day after day, as evidence piled up, the mask began to slip. He barked at Stephen in public. He slammed his fist on the defense table. At one point, when Eleanor testified against him, he actually shouted in open court, "You ungrateful woman, after everything I gave you?" The judge's gavel cut him off, but the damage was done. Cameras captured it all. The great Douglas Whitmore, the dignified patriarch, reduced to a red-faced tyrant. The world finally saw what Claire had lived. Stephen's unraveling. Stephen had always been Douglas's shadow, parroting his father's cruelty. But shadows don't stand well on their own. When Rivera presented text messages between Stephen and former servants, mocking Claire, bragging about teaching her lessons, the courtroom gasped. One message read, "Sometimes I leave her outside on purpose. She'll learn." Claire closed her eyes as the words were read, her hand tightening around mine. But she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She sat tall, her face composed. Stephen, however, crumbled. The sneer vanished, his shoulders sagged, and when Douglas turned his fury on him, "You fool, you couldn't even keep your mouth shut," the heir of the Whitmores looked less like a prince and more like a frightened child. Eleanor's redemption. Eleanor's testimony was the turning point. She entered the courtroom draped in black, her usual elegance intact. But when she spoke, her voice trembled, not from fear, but from years of silence finally breaking. "I have been complicit," she admitted. "I let my husband destroy lives because I was too afraid to lose my own. But today, I choose truth. And if that means losing everything, then so be it." Her words cut sharper than any lawyer's arguments. For the first time, the matriarch stood not as Douglas's ally, but as Claire's defender. Claire's eyes filled with tears, not because the past was undone, it never could be, but because finally, someone from inside that gilded cage had chosen to step out. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came. Douglas Whitmore, guilty of fraud, coercion, and obstruction of justice. Stephen, guilty of criminal negligence and emotional abuse. The Whitmore empire was ordered dismantled, their accounts seized, their estate repossessed. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Protesters outside cheered, cameras flashed. Douglas stood frozen, his face pale, his body rigid. For the first time in decades, the patriarch had no words. When the bailiffs moved to escort him away, he fought, snarling, shouting, his voice hoarse with rage. "This isn't over. You think you've won? You'll regret this." But his threats carried no weight. The king was dethroned, the empire was ashes. Claire's victory. As the courtroom emptied, Claire stood quietly, her hand still in mine. "You did it," I whispered. She shook her head. "No, we did it. All of us. Diane, Jonathan, Rivera, even Eleanor. It wasn't just me." But as she stepped outside into the spring sunlight, greeted not by isolation, but by cheers, I knew the truth. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was her rebirth. The girl who had once shivered by a fireplace was now a woman standing in the warmth of her own fire, one she had lit herself. The last conversation. Weeks later, before Douglas was transferred to prison, Eleanor asked Claire for one final meeting. Reluctantly, Claire agreed. They met in a quiet visiting room, the air heavy with unspoken history. Douglas was absent, already consumed by his own rage, but Eleanor looked smaller, frailer, her once proud shoulders bent. "I don't ask for forgiveness," she whispered. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know you were always stronger than any of us, stronger than me, stronger than him." Claire's lips trembled, but she simply nodded. "Then remember that, so it never happens again." And with that, Claire walked away. The epilogue. Months later, Claire spoke at a women's shelter, her voice calm but steady. She shared her story not as a victim, but as a survivor. Her words carried weight, not just because of what she had endured, but because of how she had risen. "I once thought silence was safety, but silence is a prison. Speaking out is the key. And no matter how powerful the people against you may seem, truth is stronger." The room erupted in applause. And as I watched her smile, truly smile, for the first time in years, I knew the Whitmores' legacy was over, and Claire's new life had just begun.
The Whitmore name no longer carried power. It carried shame. Their mansion was sold, their accounts seized. their portraits taken down from city halls and charity boards. What had once been a fortress of intimidation was now just another ruin, remembered only as a warning. But Claire's story didn't end with their fall. It began there. Healing. The weeks after the trial were strange. Claire described it as learning to breathe again. For years, every breath had been measured, monitored, controlled. Now, air felt free, almost overwhelming. She struggled at first, simple things like choosing her own meals, walking through the city without asking permission. Trauma lingers, even when chains are broken, but with every small step, she reclaimed herself. One morning, I found her in the kitchen humming a song she used to sing as a child, her hands moving rhythmically as she brewed coffee. It was such an ordinary moment, but I felt tears rise. Ordinary was extraordinary after what she had endured. The world responds. The Globe's article sparked a wave of national coverage. The Whitmore's collapse became a symbol of how unchecked power corrupts, of how silence protects abusers, and of how truth, when spoken, can topple even the mightiest. Claire was invited to speak at universities, shelters, and conferences. At first, she hesitated. "I'm not ready to be anyone's symbol," she told me. But gradually, she realized that sharing her truth wasn't just about her healing. It was about giving others the courage to speak. One of her first speeches was at a women's shelter in Boston. She stood before a small group of women, some bruised, some weary, all carrying invisible scars. "I was you once," she told them gently. "I thought silence kept me safe, but silence only kept me trapped. The moment I spoke, I found people waiting, not to punish me, but to help me. And you will find that too." The room was silent, heavy with emotion. And then one by one, women began to nod. Some wept, some clapped, some simply whispered, "Thank you." A visit. Months later, as summer light filtered through the windows, Claire received an unexpected visitor, Eleanor. The once imposing matriarch looked diminished, dressed plainly, her hands folded nervously. She had been granted leniency for her cooperation, but freedom weighed on her more heavily than gilded captivity ever had. "I came to see you," Eleanor said softly, "not as an apology. I know words cannot undo, but to say thank you. You did what none of us could." Claire studied her for a long moment. She could have turned her away. She could have lashed out. Instead, she simply said, "Then use your freedom differently this time." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I will." And for the first time, perhaps in her entire life, she meant it. The lesson. As time passed, I often thought about what we had endured, about the night I found my daughter shivering in the snow while her husband's family celebrated by the fire, about the years stolen from her, the empire built on cruelty, and the courage it had taken to break free. And I realized this story wasn't just about Claire or me or even the Whitmores. It was about something deeper. It was about how silence allows injustice to grow, how wealth and power can shield cruelty, and how no matter how dark the winter, even a single voice of truth can spark a fire that melts the ice. The Whitmores thought they had broken Claire, but instead, she broke their legacy. Closing. One evening, months after the trial, Claire and I sat by the fireplace, not the Whitmores' hearth of cruelty, but a modest fire in her own apartment. She sipped tea, her eyes calm, her shoulders relaxed. "Do you remember that night?" she asked quietly. "I'll never forget," I replied. She nodded, her gaze steady.
Neither will I. But I don't remember it as the night I froze anymore. I remember it as the night everything changed. The fire crackled between us. And in that moment, I knew. The story was no longer one of betrayal. It was one of survival, of transformation, of hope. Because sometimes the cruelest winters give rise to the strongest flames.